Europe is facing growing economic uncertainty, from trade tensions with the United States to industrial competition from China and the latest Iran energy shock. So how is Europe coping and what could be its priority? I'm joined in studio by Heather Grabbe, Senior Fellow at Bruegel and Visiting Professor at University College London. Heather, so glad to have you here with us on World News Tonight here in our studios in Warsaw.
Pleasure.
So, Heather, a lot is happening in the world, in the region as well. Now, let me first begin by asking you about the impact that the war in Iran has had on Europe. In particular, do you think that the conflict has exposed new vulnerabilities of the EU economy?
The vulnerability of the EU economy to fossil fuel prices has been brutally exposed. The gas price has doubled. That'll cost us probably an extra 100 billion euros in terms of the gas bill this year. And the shock to oil prices, the rising from $60 a barrel to more than 100, could add another 100 billion to the bill. So that means that Europe's energy transition has to go faster. It'll put enormous pressure on governments to try to find a way of buffering the immediate shock while also building longer-term solutions, such as building out renewable energy. But there will also be longer-term consequences which we're only just beginning to feel. For example, the impact on food prices will come through because we're now in the planting season in the spring in the Northern Hemisphere. And of course, artificial fertilizer costs have gone up dramatically because those exports are also blocked through the Strait of Hormuz.
And how do you think that also at a time, how do you think that Europe should actually be worried and concerned? If you just can tell me a little bit about more detail about those key supplies, particularly when this conflict is also disrupting global supply chains, right? And prices are skyrocketing, right? If not soaring. I mean, you just mentioned some of them, of course, the energy prices. What about, food? I mean, it's also becoming quite an issue.
Well, this particular crisis is highly problematic because it's affecting several parts of the world economy at the same time. And it's having a much more global impact than the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, which was a big shock here in the European region, but not so much elsewhere. Whereas here we're seeing everybody is affected in terms of food prices going up, and they're likely to go up a lot more. And that will cause instability. People can diversify to a certain extent in how they decide to get somewhere by trying to reduce their use of oil to put petrol in their cars. But it's much harder to do that with regard to food staples. And of course, even though Europeans are wealthier, so can afford to buy food at higher prices and also energy at higher prices, the driving up of those prices also in developing countries is going to cause instability and problems down the line. Now, supply chains of all kinds are being disrupted as a result of global shipping not being able to go through the Strait of Hormuz. And as time goes on, more parts of the supply chain will be affected. That will also have impacts on European industry. It becomes more expensive for an import-dependent economy like Europe has.
So what should Europe actually do to keep those supply chains, to keep them more secure?
Well, one method is, of course, diversification. So looking to get supplies through alternative means, so other maritime transport routes and other parts of the world. And short term, that can work, but it takes time to build really different supply chains. So the disruption will inevitably be there. Over the longer term, Europe really needs to invest in more resource productivity, in using fewer imports by being able to use resources more efficiently and building out its own circular economy. Then it would be much less vulnerable to shocks like this, which will happen not only because of military conflict like this one, but also because of climate impacts. We can expect that in the future, storms and extreme weather events like that will disrupt supply chains globally. We need to prepare for an era of disruption happening much more frequently.
So you're saying that Europe is not prepared?
At the moment, we still have an economic model which assumes that global markets will function efficiently and global trade routes will be able to operate at all times. That is unlikely to be the case in the future. We need to face a much harsher physical as well as geopolitical environment, which means the need for some longer-term strategies for the European economy.
Heather, do you think that the war in Iran, and now that's crossed over onto the Gulf countries, do you think it was another wake-up call for Europe and for its economy?
For sure, it's a big
wake-up call. Sorry to interrupt you, but we've been hearing Donald Trump say so much that that Europe says, okay, you're waking up, and Europe has to spend more on its defense, and now, hey, we have another war that is just taking place. Is this a second wake-up call for Europe?
It's a second wake-up call after the invasion of Ukraine in terms of needing to speed up the energy transition out of fossil fuels. But it's also showing the need for some longer-term planning and for Europe to get its act together and not just have 27 different national responses, but more joined-up action. Everything from building out the grids to handle renewable energy through to looking at the vulnerabilities in supply chains to Europe. And that includes supply chains from the US. At the moment, we are relying for a lot of our gas imports on liquefied natural gas from the US, which, the US ambassador said this week, well, if you guys don't help us out in the way we're asking for, we could interrupt those supplies. Now, the LNG industry in the US has freaked out about that. They don't want to hear that kind of talk. They want to be seen as a reliable supplier. But it just shows how quickly things can change and how what looked like a reliable supplier last week may not look like one next week.
Speaking of that, you just mentioned that. Do you think that once again, this partnership and this reliability between the United States and Europe, do you see this clashing?
Well, European expectations of the transatlantic relationship have fundamentally changed during this second term of Donald Trump as president. And of course, there are longer term changes going on in terms of US expectations of Europeans funding and providing their own defense to a much greater extent. So I think those changes are well understood. But the problem is that we just don't have very much time. This is all happening at once. We have to react very quickly. Politicians have to take the public with them to persuade voters that these very big transitions on energy, on defense spending, and so on, as well as then preparing for climate impacts in the future. It's a lot of change all at once, and time is not on our side.
Heather, if the Middle East war does continue, do you think that Europe is going to be exposed to another energy shock?
For sure. The energy shock is already there with a doubling of the gas price and so on. But I think the issue is, what are we going to spend the money on now?
So what should be the priority?
What should be the priority? There will be enormous pressure on governments, there already is, to subsidise fossil fuels to buffer the impact on households and on business. But the problem is, every euro that we spend on subsidising fossil fuels is a euro we don't spend on investing in renewable energy that would bring us energy independence in the longer term.
Hence, what should be the priority?
So it's a very difficult trade-off. So what we should have is targeted subsidies which help out the most vulnerable households, and we need incentives to keep the pressure up to maintain the transition to renewable energy. So electrification, for example, so heat pumps, electric vehicles, but also industrial electrification has got to be the priority now.
Heather, and just before we end this episode of World News Tonight, I just want to ask you, what kind of threats or risks should Europe be preparing for that may not be very obvious to us yet?
We've got to be able to think about the climate impacts that are coming. So Poland had, for example, really severe floods in one part of the country a couple of years ago. Those kinds of things will happen much more frequently, and they'll be much more intense. So while we're upgrading all of our infrastructure, like bridges and grids, to cope with the risk of Russian attack and Russian sabotage, we need to upgrade them also for climate impacts, because those are coming regardless of whether Putin attacks us.
Strong words. Thank you so much, Heather Grabbe, a senior fellow at Bruegel, for being my guest here today on World News Tonight. And that's all for this edition of World News Tonight here on TVP World. My name is Diana Skaya. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned here for more news and exclusive analysis.